Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening for those where it's already evening, and good morning for those where it's morning. And welcome to the 7th EEA Equitable Education Alliance meeting and webinar. If you prefer to listen this webinar in Thai language, please click the Thai interpretation channel from Zoom, or you can also watch this webinar from the live stream of EEF Thailand Facebook page. Warmly welcome to the Budgeting and Financing Mechanisms for Increased Equity in Education webinar, organized by the Equitable Education Alliance, so-called EEA. My name is Ilja Riekki from UNESCO Multisectoral Regional Office in Bangkok, and I will be your facilitator in today's webinar. This session is part of the 7th EEA meeting, where we aim to highlight one of the 4 main areas of expertise. And today we are concentrating on budgeting and financing for equity in education. We got 2 amazing speakers, which are first one, Dr. Venla Bernelius, a leading specialist from the city of Helsinki and a docent of University of Helsinki. Dr. Bernelius will be talking on needs-based resourcing as a tool for alleviating the effects of social and urban segregation. And the second excellent speaker we have today is Mr. Grageda, a project management specialist in education from USAID Philippines, who will be speaking on studies on special education fund and financing disability inclusive education. So I really hope everybody will have a great learning webinar, and we encourage you to post questions to the chat, and then our moderators will be filtering those questions, and some of those questions will be addressed to the speakers after the presentations. So we will have 2 presentations, and after this there will be time for Q&A, but you can already submit your questions during the presentations. But firstly, please allow me to introduce Mr. Anand Vichitanan, International Affairs Officer, Office for Innovation for Learning Opportunity, Equitable Education Fund Thailand, who will be giving the welcoming words. Thank you very much of all of you for being here and joining. Mr. Vichitanan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Equitable Education Alliance meeting. My name is Anand Vichitanan, International Affairs Officer for the Equitable Education Fund Thailand, or EEF. On behalf of the Equitable Education Alliance, we are very delighted to have you join today's meeting. The Equitable Education Alliance is a community of practice that advocates for more inclusive and equitable education systems across the world and strengthening the capabilities of organizations dedicated to equitable education. In terms of the topics that the Alliance's focuses, this includes a legal framework, policy development, budgeting and financing mechanisms, delivery and implementation systems, and monitoring and evaluation. In today's meetings, we've invited 2 speakers to share their experiences on budgeting and financing mechanisms that have been implemented in their communities in Finland and the Philippines. As we all know, and also based on EEF experiences, funding education can be very difficult to come by, and it's not provided adequately to school districts. It is therefore a difficult task for teachers and school staff to manage limited resources, especially for disadvantaged and underprivileged students who have their own challenges in accessing education. We hope that in today's presentations, they can provide you with valuable insights on how we can mobilize resources to provide and support students. Without any further delay, I'd like to invite back Mr. Ilja from UNESCO Bangkok to facilitate the open knowledge sharing session. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. And now I would like to give a floor to Dr. Bernelius for her topic. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here. Good morning, everyone, or day or evening, whatever time zone you are in. I'll see to it that I get my screen shared, and then we can get going on the presentation. And I might need your feedback on whether you can see my presentation, and we'll get it to presentation mode.
Yes.
Do you now see the presentation?
Yes, we see it in the presentation mode.
Great, thank you. So just a bit of background. I have worked for a long time as an assistant professor of urban geography and educational geography at the University of Helsinki. I'm also working now as a chief specialist or leading specialist in segregation and urban dynamics and education issues at the city of Helsinki. So I have been moving from kind of pure research to research-based innovation type of roles within segregation and education fields. And I'll try to use my 20 minutes today efficiently to describe you some of the challenges that we are facing in the Finnish system, and one kind of solution to that, as was wonderfully already opened here, the kind of very shared questions of educational disadvantage and maybe financing issues, although of course the educational systems tend to be slightly different. I will spend some time in the beginning in explaining the kind of dynamics of segregation that we now see in the Finnish educational system, also because understanding these dynamics is the key to understanding how the new financing models work, because they are built on the research understanding of this type of segregation and disadvantage. I have been building and participating in planning and building these national and local models in Finland. I have worked together with the Ministry of Education on the national model, consulting for that in the past 15 years. And I have also planned the model that is now in use in Helsinki that I will present to you later in the presentation. And the current model is built by our or mathematically now calculated as our wonderful researcher Netta Mäki. The book that you see on the right hand side, Finland's famous education system, Unvarnished Insights into Finnish Schooling, is a very fresh book just out of the press in January. You can find some more information on the financing system there. We wrote together with Isabel Ramos-Lobato on these topics. So there's a short chapter on these questions. Also a chapter by me and Sonja Kosunen kind of explaining these cycles of segregation. So if you get interested, it's an open access book. So please also acquaint yourself with that. But without further ado, I'll jump into the content. So as you may well be aware, Finland has kind of boasted excellent PISA results for a long time in the OECD PISA comparisons. And one of the key features of the Finnish education system has been that it has been extremely egalitarian. There's a strong public provision of education with very small kind of variance between schools in their schools' institutional quality. So financing for schools is very stable throughout the country. They are all publicly financed by the state. State funnels money to municipalities. So independent of where you live, the schools have very high quality. The differences in learning outcomes have been relatively small, quite often smallest in the OECD countries, this between school variation. And also the school system kind of is based on a very equitable provision of early childhood education and care. So that is actually a very integral part of the school system. Kids start school when they are 7, but they have spent years in very high quality early education system. However, we do see that, of course, there are differences in adult education level between municipalities. The capital region, Helsinki, is at the southernmost tip of the country, where more than half of the population have a tertiary degree. And this is the image of the country that we're used to seeing. Although results in schools have been extremely equitable, but now we do see that there are larger and growing differences between not only municipalities, but mostly within cities between schools. PISA 2018 already showed that there is what is equivalent to 2.5-year learning gap between the highest and lowest school deciles. In international standards, this is not huge, but of course in national standards that is. And we do see that background related disadvantage is certainly growing in Finland. So both socioeconomic background and immigrant background are relatively strong predictors of educational success. And in the first rounds of PISA 20 years ago, the effects of background in Finland among Iceland and Norway were the smallest in the world, but the strength of background as a predictor of educational success has grown. And what is more important is we do see patterns of segregation where especially urban neighborhoods are differentiating by parental education level, which we know now affects educational outcomes and kind of abilities in schools. And then we do see growing differences between schools. And now when we have tried to understand the dynamics of how these growing disadvantages are organized in schools and what kind of models we could use to try to tackle these programs, we have analyzed extensively the geographical patterns of educational disadvantage. Here is now the southernmost part of Finland, the few municipalities around the capital region of Helsinki, Espoo, and Vantaa cities. And in this map, we have mapped out all school catchment areas. The Finnish system is very geographical allocation based, which has actually been shown to make the differences between schools slightly smaller. In all countries, the kind of geographical correlation of spatial disadvantage and school segregation is relatively high. But if the degree of school choice is smaller, the school segregation patterns tend to be smaller. That would be a topic for another presentation. But what you can see on this map is that if we map out higher education in adult population, we actually see that this advantage, educational advantage, is very highly concentrating on a few places in the metropolitan core, in some places in Helsinki and Espoo, and then there are kind of places where the share of adults with higher education is far lower. And if we turn this image around, we look at non-educated adults, so adults with only basic education. We see that we still get areas which are located in the metropolitan core of Helsinki and Vantaa, but of course in a different place. So what we can see in this image is that there is a tendency of accumulation of different aspects of disadvantage or advantage in urban areas. Here, these two maps on the left-hand side, it is share of population with a foreign mother tongue, which in the Finnish system is also tied into educational outcomes and of course need for more support. On the right-hand side, there is share of unemployed people in the school catchment areas. And as you can see, these maps look very similar. So we do see that there's an accumulation of different aspects of advantage or disadvantage in the same school districts. There are actually, if we look at the time developments, we do see that the gaps between neighborhoods have been growing, so the differences have been growing. We also see that these spatial units, the neighborhoods that are disadvantaged or advantaged, are kind of growing in together. And there's also a very strong path dependency, so that the neighborhoods that were the most advantaged ones or the most disadvantaged ones tended to be that already 20 years ago. So even though the gaps have been growing, the rank order remains the same. And the fifth tendency that I have in my writing called the urban paradox is exactly the phenomenon that I showed you in the beginning, so that the most advantaged neighborhoods and the most disadvantaged neighborhoods can be found 1 kilometer apart in the urban core. So where we have the highest kind of economic success, educational success, we also find some of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. And this tendency is especially strong in European and North American cities, but we know that we do see these patterns all over the world in urban areas where knowledge economy produces kind of also educational winners, but then there is kind of also very large gaps between different schools. And what we know about segregation also is that children tend to be more spatially segregated than adults. So we know that families with children are even more sensitive to their living environment than for example, couples without children. And especially then families with children who have the economic means to make choices, they tend to shy away from neighborhoods which they perceive might have social problems. And that makes the segregation patterns of children even stronger than other population groups, which of course even further separates schools. One key aspect of this is also that pupil segregation in schools tends to be stronger than neighborhood segregation, as I briefly mentioned. This is because well-educated parents are more likely to choose a school outside their own neighborhood. This is also possible in most Finnish municipalities. And the schools that are mostly favored in these choices in the Finnish system, where the institutional quality of schools is very unanimous, it's actually then the choices are very often based on the socioeconomic background of the other students. This is what affects school reputations. Of course, also in countries where institutional qualities differ. So school choices then kind of separate schools even further apart. What we get from this whole pattern, this is why I've been now going through this dynamic like for such a long time, because understanding what is going on, how this disadvantage is spatially organized, and how school choices affect the system further, is the end result is that this analysis allows us to actually model mathematically and statistically the likelihood of each school to have concentrations of educational disadvantage. Here's a picture of already an old model that I did years and years back in the city of Helsinki, modeling and trying to predict educational outcomes in schools only by using neighborhood characteristics. And as you can see, R squared is very high in this, so the prediction power of this model is very strong. So I did not know anything about the schools themselves. I only modeled education level in neighborhood, share of unemployed adults, then share of pupils with foreign mother tongue, and then the kind of pupil flows, school choices between schools. And I was able to make a kind of a weather forecast for each school for what their educational outcomes would be based on these background characteristics. The model is the blue line here. And as you can see, some schools score higher than the model, some schools score lower than the prediction, but the prediction is pretty good. And then based on this kind of modeling, we started building also a kind of a needs-based model for also then giving extra resources for schools that are in risk for producing low educational outcomes. And of course, you cannot use educational outcomes as a factor, like giving schools money based on their educational outcomes, because that would create an incentive for bad outcomes, or it would punish schools which are able to kind of put in a lot of work to support their students. Then they would be punished by taking away the money. So that is why the kind of allocation model doesn't use educational outcomes, but it tries to predict them and only uses the background factors. And why this kind of needs-based allocation of resources is so extremely important also comes from understanding the dynamics of segregation. We do see that this is not only a question of segregation affecting schools' educational outcomes and the kind of future educational path of the children, but we have been able to model this picture contains dozens and dozens of research articles and kind of results put together from Finland, that we do know that this kind of segregation of neighborhoods, which then results in school segregation, it differentiates educational outcomes and school reputations, also then further affects parental choice of neighborhood also through the school reputations and creates more segregation. And this is now exactly what we have seen also in Finnish cities. So we have these kind of cycles, self-perpetuating cycles of segregation, which have resulted in even further divides between neighborhoods. And this is also the key for why the Finnish system has felt that some type of resource allocation is really needed, also to try to stop these kinds of growing tendencies for segregation. So we're not only dealing with educational disadvantage of individual students, but we are trying to fight a whole kind of a dynamic of further growing societal disadvantage and growing segregation in both cities and schools. And now the new models that have been now built based on this kind of logic and modeling the disadvantage, modeling school characteristics, are used in Finland both at local level and national level. The national level model is currently being further developed. So there's a vast project going on trying to really model and get to understand the whole country in the sense of dynamics in schools and what kind of indicators we should use in that national model development. The city of Helsinki is already using a model which I'll show you in a minute, which really bases on these school level characteristics that we know that are connected now to educational outcomes after 20 years of research and modeling how disadvantage in education is constructed socially and spatially. And many other municipalities in Finland are kind of following suit. They are developing their own programs. For example, the city of Helsinki now is using every year around 10 million euros for this additional resources for schools. There is currently a big debate also of whether that money should be doubled or tripled. We know, for example, that the city of Amsterdam is already using 5 times as much. They are spending 100 million euros every year for supporting schools in need, and their population is about double compared to, for example, the city of Helsinki, the capital of Finland. So there's also a very important discussion about how much is enough to try to really affect these phenomena. They are very persistent circles and cycles as well. But now the new funding model, as you can see, if you're familiar with statistics, the R-square of the current model, so the prediction power for educational outcomes in Helsinki is 75%, or 0.75, which is extremely high. So this model is quite good at catching schools that are at risk for for educational disadvantage, and the indicators used are the share of parents with tertiary degree, which of course lessens the risk, so it's kind of used in reverse. Then share of unemployed parents for the pupils in schools, share of pupils living in high poverty households, the lowest quintile of household income, and then the share of pupils with non-native home language, which is more of an indicator just of concentrated disadvantage. Of course, not all those pupils are themselves at risk. But that is also an important point here, that we are not trying to identify individual students or support individual students only, but we are trying to identify the shared dynamic of disadvantage in a school community and to allocate support to that school. And if I now summarize this policy basis in a very small nutshell, I think the main point that we have learned in Finland in the past 20 years of research at the university, at municipalities, at ministries, is that even very equal egalitarian institutions are not shielded from these types of circles of segregation, stigmatization, and disadvantage. So even if you have a very egalitarian funding system, institutional quality is high throughout, these kind of social dynamics of educational disadvantage and segregation can still affect the system in very harmful ways. And this is why it's not enough to get the funding to a kind of a consistent level, but we need kind of some ways to efficiently allocate extra funding to prevent some schools from getting into these cycles of segregation. So also another nutshell, the aim of the needs-based resourcing is not only to support disadvantaged pupils and schools, of course that is the main attempt and main aim, but the other aim is also to make these schools more attractive in parental school choices. If you remember, I said school choices tend to push schools further apart, so there is also an attempt to make these schools kind of more attractive for parents in school choices, and also in this way to prevent further segregation by choice. But I thank you for your patience and interest in this theme, and I hope to continue the discussion in our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Venla, for your presentation. Excellent short overview, and let's have more questions in the discussion part. We encourage the audience to submit the questions through the Q&A function. So there's a button in the bottom of the Zoom window. Over there you can submit the questions, and then our moderators will be filtering the questions for the presenters. Next, we will have Mr. Henry Grageda from USAID Philippines presenting. Henry, floor is yours. Henry, I think you're still on mute.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Let me put up my slides. Good afternoon, everyone. I am speaking from Manila in the Philippines. And my topic today is on a specific mechanism for financing coming from local governments of the Philippines that is earmarked for basic education. A second part, a smaller part, is how we applied it to financing disability inclusive education, at least in the pilot areas that we were working on. I think one of the sorry, I'm having trouble manipulating the slides.
We can see the first slide now. Ah, okay.
Yes, but
Now,
I hope we can start moving to the next slide. Maybe I'll just try to expand this.
if you press the presenter mode on, then you use the arrows, it should work.
Yeah. Let me just try it on this on this slide. Is everyone seeing the
Yes.
slide that I'm presenting? Yeah. So conceptually, I think it is important to clear up that the Philippines has divided education administration between basic education, higher education, and technical and vocational education. So today I will be speaking mainly on the basic education program and financing of the Philippines. So in our country, there are about 33 million students or children who are of school age, and that is between 5 years old and 19 years old. We have started to adopt the kindergarten to grade 12 basic education system since 2016. This population is about 30% of the households of the country, which has reached about 110 million as of 2020. The enrollment in public schools is about 23 million, with the rest taken up by the private sector as well as the alternative learning sector. There are close to 50,000 public elementary and high schools, and the classroom ratio at this time is still about one classroom for every 43 students. So it's not ideal, but this has actually improved across the years. More importantly, I think it's the number of public school teachers that we have teaching the 23 million students has reached about 900,000, of which there are about 800,000 teachers, 60,000 master teachers, and about 5,000 special education teachers. It's important to mention this, as I will go back to this later on. The Department of Education is a national and central agency administering the public schools, public basic education schools in the Philippines. It's headed by a secretary, and she heads currently 223 school divisions, which are headed by superintendents. Each of the superintendents is an educator himself or herself. And so this is critical as we take a look at how education is being financed and how the funds are disbursed and used. It is important to also say that, you know, as a central agency, the funding, the major public funding is through the General Appropriations Act, which is an act of Congress or the Parliament. However, today I will focus on what we call the Special Education Fund. The word special actually modifies the education fund rather than fund describing what it's supposed to do. So this is a local government unit fund earmarked for basic education. In the Philippines, we have about 80 provinces and 1,500 cities and municipalities. So each of them is called a local government unit. And they are tasked to collect real property tax, and the Special Education Fund is pegged against this real property tax value. Often it is the same as what citizens or residents pay in real property tax. So if you pay $100 for your property tax, you also pay an equivalent $100 for your Special Education Fund contribution. In all, at least in 2018, when we conducted this, with the data we used for this study, there are about 33 billion which is about I think it's about 750 million, 33 billion pesos. Sorry about that. About $750 million. It's quite small compared, but it is a significant segment of the LGU income, which is about 5%. What is important to consider here is that this special education fund is administered by the local school board. So it's administered by the province or by the city, along with the division, the school division superintendent. So the way I would describe it is that the special education fund is not simply a financing mechanism, but also a governance mechanism for education at the local level. And I will try to explain how this impacts on education funds at the local level. In this slide, I wanted to show you that the SEF, as we call it, which is collected by local governments, is basically just 6% of the total public financing envelope for basic education. I just simplified it to include the national and the local allocations. In this slide, and I will explain a little bit more later, the SEF can actually be allocated or allotted to different types of expenditures at the local level. However, before that, I want to see to share with you that even the SEF, it demonstrates the disparity, or using the professor's term a while ago, the segregation between the income classes, especially among the regions of the Philippines. Here I am showing to you the distribution of the SEF per capita based on the number of students in those regions in pesos. And here you can see that among the 17 regional administrations, the range is quite large. So you have a region which is the newly created Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, which has only 37 pesos, that's less than $1 for each student for an entire year, generated through the SEF. And on the other extreme, you have the National Capital Region, Metro Manila, which has over 6,000 pesos or over $120 per student in a year. So the disparity is quite high. And this is likely because of the structure of the SEF, since it's pegged on real property values. The regions that have high property valuations, which are usually in, where cities dominate and where industries are prevalent, this is where you get a lot more collection. Compare this to the national appropriations. And here I am only showing the maintenance and operating expenses of the Department of Education, the central national transfers to each of the regional entities. And you would see here that there is a lot less differentiation if it's coming from the national government. And this is being driven by a new formula on the allocation of the MOE, as we call it here, that is based on a uniform figure with modifiers that reflect the number of students, the number of teachers, and in a way, the income level of the areas. And here, if you try to take note, the two regions that we mentioned, NCR, the national capital, actually receives a lot less than the other regions in terms of the nationally administered MOE per capita. So in a way, how does this impact on the financing of education at local levels? What we see here is essentially not necessarily a correction, but at least a representation of how national and local financing mechanisms tend to, at least smoothen out some of the great disparities between the two types of financing. The orange bar portion of the bar reflects the MOE per capita transferred by the national government, and the blue portion of the bar reflects the per capita income. So in this case, you would see that the national allocations in certain areas, while small, is in a way balanced out by the local allocations. And here you would notice that there are certain regions where the local allocations actually exceed or surpass the national allocations. And I think this is largely because of the income levels in these areas, which also are reflected in property values, and therefore the local collections. I go back to this slide to take a look at the right side, which is really how the LGU Special Education Fund is allocated. I would like to demonstrate that in the sub-allotment of the Special Education Fund, you have a lot more going on. And for instance, while there the SEF, because it is administered at the local level, is able to more finely allocate or appropriate or allot the fund towards the locally identified priorities. So for instance, in this bigger pie chart, where only 6% is allotted to projects and programs at the local levels, it is still demonstrably useful because the local government can now allocate it for local priorities. So in this case, this can be allocated to special programs, including special education, early childhood care, and alternative learning. What I think is more important when discussing the Special Education Fund is not the SEF per se, but how it manages to influence the decision-making at the local level. This slide shows a table of different local governments who in the in the second column will show how small their SEF collections are. But because of how they are budgeting for education, they are also able to tap the general fund of the local government, so that in fact, in certain cities like Del Carmen in Surigao, which is a small island in the south of the Philippines, the ratio of financing from the local government general fund to the SEF is at 10:1. So they've funded 10 times more from their general fund than what they are able to collect. And I think this is a function of the ability of the local government to learn from how to budget the SEF and then apply it to the different priorities of the local government. And in this case, at least for the local governments here, it resulted into greater investments, local investments in education beyond the Special Education Fund. So I'd like to transition now into how this was applied into special education. So I'm managing a program that is intended to increase the access of deaf, blind, and deaf-blind children to quality education. We also did a study in 2022 to take a look at how disability inclusive education is being financed. One of the conclusions as of 2022 is that we have yet to integrate equity-based financing mechanism to ensure the distribution of education resources to support inclusion. You've noticed from how I described the MOE and SEF that we have very little actually that is being invested into education, at least on a per capita basis. And Obviously, if you try to drill down into the larger requirements for disability education, this will continue to be a challenge. So at the moment, we are currently at building block 1 of a five block framework for financing disability inclusive education. The pictures we have here are of the small project that I manage that hope to develop financing models from our pilot programs at different municipalities in the country. So I said we are at level 1, where basically policies and laws were in place. We are lucky because in 2022, there's a new law that now mandates inclusion of education of children with disabilities into the financing from the Department of Education and at the local level. These are the components that are included in the law. We need to look for the children with disabilities, especially those who are not aware that there are special needs education facilities and resources in those areas. We need to build learning resource centers, and we need to train more special needs teachers and education. In the 2023 budget of the Department of Education, there are now modest allocations to start this up. We do not know if these are sufficient at the moment, but this is a good start. And this is where I think it is critical to bring in our lessons, and particularly for the Philippines and in one specific province, we had worked successfully with the provincial governor, who you see here at the center of this photograph, who has adopted our pilot program and has mandated that it be implemented throughout the province. So they basically adopted the program, which we call Gabay or Guide in Filipino. And a major portion of this is, well, what I consider a success is that because of our program, we have produced models that the local school board has taken on. And now, because of this local ordinance, it's a local law essentially that now mandates that the special education fund be also allocated or allotted annually for children with disabilities. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have on our small example from the Philippines. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Henry. Is there something you want to use a minute to tell a bit more on your role or USAID role related to this policies or future steps?
Yes, thank you for that. So my presentation is based on 2 projects that I managed and a specific research on disability inclusive financing that was conducted region-wide, and in which the Philippines was a case study. And so I'm able to share the early findings from that study, which I think will be published a little bit later in the year. Well, so my role is really, my presentation is really coming from a practitioner's perspective. I've been working with the Department of Education as well as with local governments for close to 20 years. Much of that is really trying to take a look at how budget items are allocated. We would love to have what Norway has in terms of information that can model how local education institutions should be able to be budgeted. But in our case, I think that is compensated by the democratization essentially of the education budgeting process. And I think the model of the Special Education Fund and it being administered by a local school board, which is composed of not only the local chief executives, but by the school division superintendent, by the parent teachers associations, as well as youth representatives. I think it opens up a lot of discussion on what the priorities should be for local education ecosystems, as we might call it. So we still have the study on the special education fund, and the project around that was completed in 2021. I am still managing an ongoing disability inclusive education project. And I think a good way to round that off is that we just had a meeting with the Department of Education, and they are interested in bringing our small pilot and what we learned in as far as working with local governments nationwide. And I think that's a welcome initiative of the department. Thank you. Back to you, Ilja.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Can we also have Venla on board for questions? So we have now 20 minutes left, so I encourage audience still to post questions to through the Q&A function. We have few questions already, which you can see on the screen. So for the first presentation to Venla or Dr. Bernelius, can you explain more on the right to learn and school for education using needs-based resources? It seems very interesting to use data to tell other actors how to help. Any advice for developing countries on how to convince government to initiate similar budgeting mechanisms for local districts? Not a simple question, but
no, I think if I had a perfect answer to that, I would be touring the world,
yes.
telling it. But I appreciate the question. I think this is a very core question. I think. Firstly, about the use of this funding. In the Finnish case, it has been demonstrated that this kind of extra funding is very useful. And through OECD studies, we do know that investing in both early childhood education and basic education are one of the most profitable investments that a country can do. And it is the most profitable when extra resources are allocated to the students from disadvantaged backgrounds. The kind of return to that investment is very large. So I think kind of convincing governments to invest in this could be made into also an economic argument. With the global knowledge economy, we do know that the largest resource any country can have is a well-educated workforce that also draws in foreign investment, and the large inequalities in education do lessen also the use of human potential, that whenever there is a lack of kind of opportunity and larger kind of background effects for educational success, we do kind of lose a lot of talent. So there is also a return for equality in education, and these investments are extremely effective. There's an abundance of OECD research on that. So I think that the argument for convincing governments to do this, that they are very kind of easily found from for example, OECD studies. But the using also of these needs-based resources, in Finland, one of the guiding principles has been that schools which have very highly educated teachers and skillful principals usually know best where to allocate the extra resources. Schools are very good experts of their own needs. So this, of course, there is a shared curriculum for all schools, and the basic budget for schools is controlled, so schools know where they have to spend the money and what kind of qualifications they need for teachers that they hire. But this extra budget is freely used by schools for whatever the schools themselves deem that they need. However, there has been critique also in Finland that schools would need some extra support in kind of knowing about other experiences in schools. And we have actually just finished doing a kind of a package for schools where we have collected evidence and views from different schools about where they have used the money and how well they think that those types for spending money have been useful. But there's certainly more research that we would need on that. Usually what schools use this money for is smaller size of classes, extra special education like teachers or other professionals helping out in the schools, and to some degree they do use it also for kind of providing what could be called cultural capital for the children, so extra school trips, extra kind of social events, so that they also, the schools try to invest in bridging these gaps in what could be called cultural capital between kind of students, giving ideas and extra opportunities for children. Did I answer this question at all now? I hope I did.
Thank
Partly.
you. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Venla. Then I guess there's questions for both of the speakers. So maybe we get Venla's answer first, and then Henry can continue. Since the third question is also for Henry. So the question from the audience is that how can we overcome inequality in education in a multiracial country where there is segregation due to many reasons, including parents' educational and economic background? It is more alarming in urban public schools, particularly after pandemic. The literacy level of students have dropped drastically with too much of emotional and social issues. The ratio of school dropouts is also quite high lately. How can we as teachers tackle this? Thank you.
I think this is also an extremely important and also heartbreaking question. And I think teachers can only do so much. There are things that of course teachers cannot alone kind of do. This is a question that has worried researchers and practitioners also in Finland. We do see a very similar trend in Finland that the pandemic really hit the communities most, which were most vulnerable to begin with. And there is a lot of social disconnect in many neighborhoods and multiplying problems among the youth and failures to kind of connect to communities and to institutions such as schools. One thing that has been found very useful in some of the projects that I'm familiar with, for example, now in Finland, is just the stronger attempt to really work together with different institutions and different practitioners. For example, there have been very tight networks now formed between the schools and the social workers, different local organizations. In Finland, church is not a very prominent actor, but in many countries, the church communities are important. I think the Icelandic model, if you're familiar with that, it provides a very good framework of how to organize kind of local institutions and actors through schools, kind of using school as a node for larger interventions. And this could be something that maybe could be explored to actually really bring in other actors to work together with schools, with the idea that this is now not a challenge that can be solved with only kind of academic input, but rather with social work and kind of really working together with the communities, trying to support students through all the different actors and not to leave teachers alone with the question. This is something that at least has been deemed quite helpful in the Finnish context as well.
Thank you. So thinking of a school as a community function rather than only an educational institution.
Exactly.
Henry, for the question number 2, the same question to you.
Yeah, I share Professor Venla's enthusiasm about this question, because this actually speaks to the heart of education. And as you say, schools are not only about education, but about, respecting diversity and ensuring inclusivity in the community. And I think, at least in the Philippines, I know of, I mean, hopefully without oversimplifying it, two basic approaches. One of them, and I think my slide on the disparity of the Special Education Fund tended to show it. The newest administrative region we have there, which has less than $1 per student in allocation, is actually the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. And prior to about 5 years ago, this has not been constituted yet, and there's lots of there. It was really a conflict affected area, where students, in fact, were either dropped out or had to migrate elsewhere just to avoid the conflict. And I think, to some extent, the political settlement in creating this new autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao gives and empowers the people of that region with the authority and, of course, the resources to allocate it along the lines of what they want. And I think that's a bigger message about conflict affected areas, and really the need to bring in a political settlement angle, even and especially in education. So that's one part of it. The other big approach is what I discussed, and that is really increasing democracy around democratizing education choices, and the ability to budget the allocations both from the national and local governments. And this already speaks in part to the question in number 3. And officially, based on the law, we only have the chief executive, the governor or mayor, the school division superintendent, the chairperson of the education committee of the local council, the PTA representative. So you just basically have 5 persons identified as members of the local school board. But in our project, which is interestingly enough called Education Governance for Effectiveness Project, or EDGE as we called it then, took a look at local governments that wanted to expand the participation in the local school board to include special sectoral groups like the women's organizations, and then in some cases, and well, in many cases, the private sector also came in, especially in areas where the workforce was considered weak, in a sense that they were not really prepared to work in that area. And so education was critical in those areas, particularly in the tourism sites around the country, where you have these large resorts, establishments surrounded by largely poor agricultural areas. Many of their staff in those hotels do not actually come from the communities, and this has created tensions even in some communities. And I think their effort to also contribute to education is part of that process of integrating and making it inclusive. Lastly, as in the case of our disability inclusive education program, we have started to integrate persons with disabilities organizations in the discussion. So in that specific case around Batangas province, it was actually the head of the Persons with Disabilities Affairs Office who promoted the promulgation of that local law that now institutionalizes inclusive education into the local special education fund allocations. Thank you. I hope that was helpful. Back to you, Ilja.
Thank you so much, Henry. I think there's one more question from the audience. Reading it directly from the Q&A. What educational provision should be addressed to Myanmar, particularly after the coup, as Myanmar is needed urgent comprehensive support from global communities to respond to super demands of educational needs from the people from Myanmar? This is a very contextual question to one specific country, but maybe it can be generalized to similar education in emergencies context. If either of you have an answer to this one, please do share, but I understand if your expertise doesn't go to education in emergencies setting.
Yeah, maybe I can respond from a less controversial aspect. I don't know if I am authorized to speak about our initiatives in Burma, but I can say that our Burma office is actually located in Bangkok, and I hope that you can pay them a visit if you wanted to learn more about that. But I think I can speak from our experience in the Philippines in at least one of the areas that was conflict affected. And so this area was besieged by extremist organizations in the middle of about 2017. And so we laid out some early interventions, which is basically to ensure that the students who were migrating out or basically escaping the conflict areas were received in the outlying areas, and to some extent programming for facilities and services in the outlying school divisions was critical in that case. I think more importantly, from a post-conflict situation, it's really a challenge of recovering the students who had decided to move away. I think one of the functions of the education ecosystem, particularly in the use of the learner information system, is ensuring that we can locate those students wherever they are. So if they had enrolled in another division, then the system can basically recover their education credentials previously, and so it would not unduly or add to the delay in their further education. So that's one. The other aspect is really rebuilding the schools and other services for students in those areas. And in emergencies, I think it is critical to note that at least in the Philippines, whether it is a typhoon and flooding that is affecting, or an earthquake or a volcanic eruption or a conflict, often the schools are the evacuation points for the citizens or the residents of that community. And so to avoid disruption of education, I think there are mechanisms and many organizations are setting this up. And as you call it, this is an education in emergencies approach to it. I hope that the Burma situation improves. We are in fact looking into it, but I don't think I'm in a position to share those initiatives at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are 4 minutes to the end of the Q&A time, so I'm using this last minutes to get short, crisp advice to decision makers. So from your perspective, whether we're talking about a district level or city or urban rural setting, what would be your advice of an intervention to increase equity through budgeting and financing? So a quick if you would be in an elevator with the decision maker, with the mayor who would have a decision making power, what would you, in 50 seconds, what would you advise, convince this decision maker to get started with? Venla, you already opened your mic, so I guess you want to start.
Well, I could start by saying that first of all, education should be seen as an investment and not as a kind of just a hole in the budget that we do know that investing in this is extremely efficient. And secondly, that we should see it as a larger whole than just the individual students or schools, that there is a need to look at the investment in a community basis. Schools are heart of communities, and if we want to increase equality, we need to think about urban planning, zoning, community support, and school together. But investing in schools can also draw in kind of wealthier families with children and so on, so they are an extremely good investment. And maybe thirdly, I would say that it's also extremely important to think about supporting the whole school, because quite many funding systems are targeting kind of individual families or children, but we do see that the face of disadvantage is often kind of facing whole communities, and it's extremely important that the whole school is supported and the teachers are supported. So maybe this would be, and also investing in early childhood education and care, because many inequalities travel to school already from quite a young age. So maybe these 4 points I would try to cram into my 50 seconds in the elevator.
Thank you, Venla. What about Henry?
Yes, thank you. Well, at the central level, national level, data is really important. And I think as Professor Venla demonstrated, that this is a powerful approach to actually equitizing education financing. Really, we should help central government set up really good and reliable data information systems, whether it's on the outcomes of the school districts or school divisions, as we call them here, or in fact the inputs to education, particularly the prices of the inputs to educations. There are often problems in the procurement of certain education inputs that can be remedied by a better information system on the supply side of education inputs. The second is really what I've talked about mostly here. It's really equitizing, democratizing governance of education. So while it is centrally administered by the Department of Education, local communities who have most at stake, right, in terms of the workforce, in terms of the future, in terms of the happiness of their communities, I should actually be informed and be participating in the discussions on the budgets for education. And I think to a certain extent, the SEF has allowed this to happen, especially at the local level. And this has not only affected the local financing, local education financing, but has also influenced the principals and the superintendents to actually open themselves up. And so the parent teachers associations are now increasingly becoming part of this. The last point is really on, financing is one side, one side of the equation. The disbursement is also an important part. And I've been monitoring, issues around the disbursements, trying to compare what is allotted and what is eventually disbursed. And there are problems on the disbursement side that I think should be addressed. And this is critical in developing countries because, resources are scarce. And so if you don't use them at all, then they're actually wasted. So I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Bernelius and Mr. Grageda, for your time and for your presentations. And now we will move to the closing part of the meeting, where we will have the closing remarks from CMEO Director.
Thank you.
Your Excellencies, distinguished speakers and guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen, a wonderful day to everyone. It is a great honor and pleasure to meet all of you today. The Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, or CMEO, is honored to partner and collaborate with the Equitable Education Fund, Ministry of Education Thailand, UNESCO Bangkok, UNICEF East Asia and the Pacific Regional Office, UNICEF Thailand, in holding the 7th meeting of the Equitable Education Alliance, or EEA. This partnership underscores the meeting's theme, budgeting and financing mechanisms for increased equity in education. Apart from this meeting, we have worked hand in hand to ensure learning continuity and learning recovery under the principles of inclusive and equitable education. CMEO, as a Southeast ASEAN intergovernmental organization promoting regional cooperation in education, science and culture, has been in the forefront of ensuring inclusive and equitable education in the region. We have worked with ministries, organizations, groups and schools to develop and implement programs that are responsive to the needs and challenges of the region. Our programs are anchored on our priority area on removing barriers to inclusive education with the end of reaching the unreached, the marginalized, and the vulnerable sectors. With 26 centers across Southeast Asia and across specializations from early childhood to lifelong learning, we are committed to transforming education for a better quality of life in Southeast Asia. CMEO is also a member of the High-Level Steering Committee for Education 2030, which is tasked to monitor the progress of the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 4, inclusive and equitable quality education. With this, CMEO will represent Southeast Asia and participate actively in the Education World Forum 2023 in the UK and the Intergovernmental Special Committee Meeting 1974 recommendations in UNESCO headquarters, Paris in May 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, 7 new global initiatives were launched at the United Nations Transforming Education Summit 2022, which served as the call to action of the SDG 4 High-Level Steering Committee in December 2022. One of the global initiatives was on transforming the financing of education. Public spending is a powerful instrument to promote inclusive growth, especially in education. This was at the core of the discussion during the World Bank and IMF Spring Meetings event on April 13. In that meeting, the false dichotomy between more and more effective public spending on education was discussed. The meeting also explored how we can position education at the core of domestic financing conversations and how we can advocate it as part of broader national sustainable development efforts. Apparently, Southeast Asian countries have been significantly investing in education. Government expenditure on education ranges from 2 to 7% of GDP. As a share of GDP, public spending on education has remained relatively stable in the past decade. This pattern indicates higher nominal spending as these countries have all become more prosperous during the period, with Malaysia and Vietnam spending more on education compared to the average global spending. Based on the United Nations Transforming Education Summit 2022 reports, during the pandemic, over 2/3 of developing countries cut their education budgets. Global inequalities were staggering, with high-income countries spending over 43 times as much on every child than low-income countries. These international disparities are compounded by disturbing inequalities in educational investment within countries. Hence, there is certainly an urgent need to protect and increase both domestic budgets and international financing for education from all sources. I believe that the presentations on budgeting and financing mechanisms for equity in education, both practitioner and national level in this session, have highlighted how we form a network of countries and international organizations that are strong advocates for equity in education systems and learn from each other's work and assess the possibility of forming the alliance. The question that we should be asking ourselves is whether the agreed budget allocation and the actual resultant budget expenditures promote more equitable educational outcomes. According to the European Union 2020 report, in order to assess the equity of sector allocations and spending, the education sector performance should be measured both in terms of effectiveness and equity. It is important to bear in mind that a given year's increase in primary education budgets may take several years to impact on completion or graduation rates and even longer to impact upon learning outcomes. In order to achieve an equitable financing system, policy linkages between resource allocation and impact through results-based planning and financing must be strengthened. We should invest more on program-based budgeting, such as procurement and investment management, payroll management, budget reconciliation, and financial reporting. Combating leakage and corruption is also an imperative effort which will increase the transparency in resource flow and resource allocation decisions. Ladies and gentlemen, equity is a fundamental value and guiding principle of education policy at the national and international levels. The right to education for all has been enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, and equity in education is also a specific target of the Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations in 2015. So let's work hard on ensuring equitable distribution of government educational resources within the Southeast Asian countries. We need to ensure that all countries in our region succeed in aligning the quality of resources with challenges of disadvantaged students and schools. By working together, we can transform education and make education systems more inclusive and equitable, particularly in budgeting and financing mechanisms in education. Shukran. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Habibah Abdul Rahim, Director from CIMEO Secretariat, for your closing words. Without further ado, thank you for the active audience for participation. Thank you for Mr. Grageda and Dr. Bernelius for your insightful talks. I'm happy to close this meeting, and I would encourage the audience to follow our social media accounts in Facebook and Twitter account of UNESCO Bangkok for further events and information. Thank you everybody for attending today.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you very much.